So why are we here today talking about cybersecurity for nonprofits? The answer is simple, and that is that nonprofits are increasingly a target for hackers. The news headlines you see here tell the story. When you read that YMCA or Goodwill or the Red Cross and USAID have been attacked, it really concerns us. We're all involved in the nonprofit sector, and we want to know how to get to greater safety. You might be aware of some of these stories, but just to highlight a few that have hit the news, and they are concerning because PII, or personally identifiable information, has been leaked as a result of these, and that has some serious repercussions. For example, in the Utah Food Bank, there was an incident where 10,000 plus personal individuals had their personal information leaked via donation website exposed by a hacker. With the Red Cross, we had an attack on their servers where more than 500,000 individuals had, again, personal data, confidential information leaked. The YMCA of Greater Charlotte had an incident that included ransomware, and we don't even know how many users that affected. Ransomware continues to be a serious threat to companies, and nonprofits are no exception. We have a e-commerce attack on the Shop Goodwill platform, and that also leaked information for their customers. So there's a few of them. You've got some headlines. I'm sure you're all aware of this kind of the severity of the topic, and we're really happy to pull folks together and experts in the space to talk about it, provide tips, and engage this group in a discussion that addresses the subject. And next slide. And with that, I will turn it over to James Eaton-Lee to take our keynote.
Thanks. Give me 1 second, and I'll just bring some slides up. Okay, super. So hopefully you're all able to see those. And hello, thank you to the team at Avanade for having us here. My name is James Eaton-Lee. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for an organization called NetHope. In the past, I have a background in cybersecurity in the private sector. I was a security consultant for about 10 years, but for the last 5 or 6 years, I've had roles in the nonprofit sector. I ran the cybersecurity and data protection team at Oxfam, which is a global nonprofit, for several years. Worked for a tech startup in the space. But at NetHope, I'm a member-facing chief security officer. My role is largely external. NetHope, for anyone that's not familiar with it, is a US 501c3. We're a nonprofit, but we're a member-based nonprofit. Our members consist of roughly 65 of mostly the largest development, humanitarian, and conservation actors. We're about 20 years old, and almost all of our work focuses on tech, the impact of tech on our nonprofits' work to help them increase their impact, the opportunities that it presents, but also the risks when we don't get it right. Between them, our nonprofits service about 1.2 billion people, and they account for about 60% of all non-governmental aid. I said my role at NetHope is primarily member-facing. I lead on something which we call the Digital Protection Program. Our Digital Protection Program recognizes that today, cybersecurity, privacy, data ethics failures are potentially existential issues for nonprofits. 5-10 years ago, perhaps we thought of these as IT problems, but really today they're things that have to be approached quite strategically. And the slide that's on the screen gives you a sense how we think about these issues within NetHope. We know that the consequences don't just include regulatory risk, financial cost. They also include some quite deep challenges with fundraising, with trust, but also very real harms that humanitarian development and other sorts of nonprofits can cause if they get digital wrong. This also gives you a clue as to why at NetHope we don't have a cybersecurity program, we have a digital protection program. Any of you who are listening who come from the humanitarian space, or that's where you have experience, will know that protection in the work of an NGO seeks to mitigate and understand the sort of more physical impact of failures of NGO programming on individuals. So, understanding physical safety, thinking about risks of PSCA or safeguarding. And for us, digital protection is a a very mindful choice, because it conveys how we feel these issues should be understood, whether you're thinking cybersecurity or data protection or data ethics, or a little bit more broadly. They're really digital aspects of ways that we're sort of used to thinking, but in this slightly new landscape that we're presented with in the digital age. Thinking about how we start to make that bridge. Sometimes when I talk to nonprofits, I say that cybersecurity is very similar to architecture or automotive engineering. It's a complex problem, I say, for anyone who's not familiar with the distinction between complex and complicated, not just because it has many moving parts, but in particular because it's something that's difficult to predict. It's a dynamic and quite adaptive thing. I'll come back to some of the reasons for that in a minute. But like architecture or like automotive engineering, it's something that requires intention and structure to respond to. So the types of consequences we saw in the previous slide, from sort of regulatory to trust, we know we can only avoid those issues if we think about how we embed in our organizations, in our technology stacks, and in our culture, a set of safeguards that are designed to bring about a particular outcome. You wouldn't get in a building, you wouldn't jump in a car that hadn't been engineered, that hadn't been crash tested. Cybersecurity is the same. And, very simple. We can end on this slide if you like, but down the left-hand side of the slide, and of course it's more complicated than this, some of the things we know we need to start doing as an NGO in order to ensure that we have a robust cybersecurity program. So do we have the right leadership, the right people in charge? Are we empowering them with the right knowledge of what they're defending? Do they understand what digital assets, what program areas, what people we have that might be targeted? Can we build the right technical safeguards into those? And have we made the right technology choices that allow us to do that? Do we have the right people culture, knowing that human decision making is at the root of many cybersecurity breaches, whether that's clicking on an email or not being thoughtful when procuring a cloud system, or maybe punching a credit card in online to buy a new digital tool. When things fail, do we have the right teams? Do we have the right tools and technologies to detect that they failed, to understand that somebody's account has been logged into, or something has been integrated in a way that it shouldn't, or a file has been downloaded? And then thinking about continuously tailoring the way that we do that to the kind of organization we are. So some areas of our work might require a lot more rigor, where we're working with payment card data, or where we're working with vulnerable people in a conflict setting. And then, of course, understanding and communicating that we deliver value for money, but also that what we're doing is right for the organization, is delivered in a well-governed way. We can already start to see, even if you're not a cybersecurity specialist, where this is. There are many moving parts within the cybersecurity programs in NGOs. And of course, the bottom two bullets on this slide, doing it defensively, ensuring that we can demonstrate when things do go wrong, that we were thoughtful about the way we approach the problem. Suddenly the comparison with architecture maybe starts to seem familiar, and any cybersecurity people on the call will immediately recognize on the right-hand side of the slide the NIST cybersecurity framework. So the US government framework, which has these 5 quadrants and represent another way of thinking about this problem, of being intentional at the beginning, of identifying what it is you want to defend against, of protecting your systems, and then of recovering, detecting breaches in your systems, and recovering from any damage that might have been caused. So already we get a sense of why this is a difficult problem to solve. And picking up on some of the themes in the introduction, is if that wasn't bad enough, we know that this is a very different game to 5 or 10 years ago, in particular because of this A word at the top of the slide. Cybersecurity differs from architecture or automotive engineering in that there are people trying to make your building fall down. There are people trying to ensure that your car comes off the road. Cybersecurity fundamentally is an adversarial problem. It's adversarial because breaches in systems aren't an accident, they're not a coincidence. The fact notwithstanding that, of course, if you mismanage your systems, you might inadvertently produce a breach. Or thinking more about data ethics or data protection problems, you might use data in a way that causes harm yourself. But when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're mostly thinking about other humans or other groups of humans who have organized in such a way as to cause our data and cause our systems to be used in ways that we don't want. Fundamentally, cybersecurity is about negating that. Unfortunately, today, this adversarial nature of cybersecurity is no longer curious teenagers or whatever kind of Hollywood metaphor you might want to use. It's in fact highly commoditized and highly commercial. And that's one of the first things that when we coach NGOs through thinking about their cybersecurity, we try to convey and try to help them to understand. Breaches in systems are monetized. And actually, the marketplace is deep and rich. We're all familiar probably with the wave of ransomware that most organizations have seen in the last few years. But if you've not looked into what ransomware is, you might not know, for example, that a lot of ransomware, the tools that are produced to allow data on your systems to be locked are produced by one actor who then sells them to another actor, who may also buy access to your systems in order to use those tools in order to extort money from you. There's a huge and broad marketplace for everything from tools to initial access. Essentially, if it's profitable to do something, somebody probably will. That's different compared to 10, 15 years ago. It's different even compared to 3 or 4 years ago. Secondly, we're increasingly seeing that attacks against NGOs are politically sponsored. And actually, ransomware is an example of this. There are various governments who, if you read public coverage, there's a strong link that's been drawn between criminal activity in various states who indirectly sponsor particular kinds of breaches. But actually, we can go a step beyond that and observe that many breaches in NGO systems are directly politically motivated. One of the stories that's currently relatively high up in the news cycle on the right-hand side, a tool made by a company called NSO Group called Pegasus, which is essentially a targeted surveillance tool designed to access the mobile phones of individuals in order to extract data or contact lists. And we know widely used across the world, including to target lawyers, journalists, NGO workers, human rights defenders. This represents the commercial marketplace for tools that in many instances are not used in ways perhaps that were even intended by the companies that sold them, but certainly not that we might consider to be desirable or moral or lawful. We know, in fact, that in any context where NGOs operate, whether it's any kind of conflict, any kind of dispute over power, these sorts of tools are increasingly used to target NGOs. And one of the most recent pieces of coverage, you can see the Guardian article on the right-hand side, relates directly to an active conflict zone where we know that these tools have been used. And whether you're thinking, Syria, whether you're thinking South Sudan, any sort of humanitarian or development context in which NGOs move, where power is an issue or conflict is an issue, we know that this kind of activity is undertaken by state and non-state actors. They will procure tools in order to get access to NGOs' phones, to understand what they're doing, to get access to their desktops, potentially to disrupt what they're doing. The last point I'm going to make about the way in which cybersecurity has changed in the last few years is that it's heavily automated. If you'd been talking about cybersecurity in a boardroom 5 years ago, you might have said something like, really what we need to do is make ourselves an unappealing target. And it wouldn't have been a horrendous way to approach cybersecurity, a little bit like the way you might think about your house, that actually your goal is to make your house unappealing to break into, putting big bars on the windows and a big sign that says cameras, a big lock, so that somebody goes further down the street. Unfortunately, as well as the political motive, as well as this large sort of criminal and commercial marketplace, one of the other things that is changing is that attacks against systems are heavily automated. It used to be the case that if I wasn't interested in your house, I'd go down the street and I'd jiggle the next door. Today, I can jiggle every door handle on the street to see which ones are unlocked almost instantly. Before we even start thinking about tools like machine learning, the level of automation that's possible with modern cloud systems is enormous. If it's out there on the internet, if it's unprotected, somebody will find it. So this better than our peers approach, it really doesn't work. Cybersecurity today is a problem that everybody has to win collectively. And yet, in spite of the media coverage and in spite of this sort of what you might view as common knowledge broadly within the cybersecurity industry, we know it remains a large problem. Last year, we ran a survey across our members. We're due to publish the report in the next couple of weeks on the state of cybersecurity and humanitarian and development actors. We know from our data that about 2/3 of our members tell us that they don't have confidence in the cybersecurity program that they're running. We know from the data that we have, in which we ask members about their governance structures, the breaches that they've experienced, how they manage cybersecurity, that only about 1/3, in fact, have a senior cybersecurity specialist in charge of some kind of program. And by that, I mean a director or a chief security officer or something similar. Now, if you go to the private sector, it would be unusual at this point in time not to have a post holder like that. We'll get onto the reasons in a moment. When we think about some of these more sophisticated attacks, whether it's sort of ransomware at the lower end or something a little bit more advanced, the tools that we use to detect those kinds of attacks, things like endpoint detection and response or next generation antivirus, sophisticated data-driven tools which allow organizations to see what's happening on their systems and respond as part of that sort of fast detection and response lifecycle. Only around half of large INGOs tell us that they actually have the skills to use those tools, even if they have the tools themselves. Meanwhile, our partners at Microsoft this year reported that NGOs and think tanks from their data are the second most targeted sector outside government. So hopefully the picture is clear. The marketplace is huge, the problem is large. And of course, a lot of the reason for these gaps is the funding model. So very few of our members, if we ask them directly, I suspect would tell us that they didn't want a senior cybersecurity specialist employed, but 67% of them do tell us that their cybersecurity budget is insufficient. And about 1 in 10 actually don't have figures. The cybersecurity budget is blended with the rest of their IT spend. And you get a sense from the bottom of this slide of why. For most NGOs, revenues have increased marginally in the last 5 to 10 years, whilst the damage, but also the cost of cybersecurity have risen enormously. Private sector organizations tend to have tripled, quadrupled their spending on cybersecurity in the last 2 to 3 years. Very few NGOs have been able to. So I want to talk for a minute or two about our work and what we're trying to do to respond to this problem. I mentioned on one of the first slides that we have something called a digital protection program. The Digital Protection Program at NetHope is essentially a capacity building program for our member NGOs. And what we're trying to do through it is provide them with immediate short-term support to help them with cybersecurity problems, but also, as you might have guessed based on my slide on funding, to start to try to think about more systemic change, which allows NGOs to be able to build better cybersecurity programs. We kickstarted our digital protection program in July of last year. The very first thing we started to offer for those sort of 70% of NetHope members that don't have a chief security officer was that they could access one. So our member organizations, thanks to the kind support of our sponsors and donors, and you can see some of our partners and donors at the bottom of the slide, the very first thing we were able to offer was you have a friend that you can phone. And our members have used that in a variety of quite creative ways. We've helped our members build cybersecurity strategies for the first time. We've helped them hire staff. We've helped them with breach response, and that's free for our members. We've worked across about a third of our member base, I think, at this point. Actually, it's slightly more than on the slide currently with this sort of targeted consultancy. But we know that we're not going to solve the problem purely by working into our NGO's sort of management structures. We've also started working on that stat I gave you a slide ago, in which our members told us that they don't have the skills to use the tools. We've started trying to close that gap. With the SANS Institute, we've run a program this year where we've trained 73 people with a quite high-tech foundational cybersecurity skills. In year 2 of our program, which we're going into, we're going to start to move into blue team or cyber defensive skills. And we've also started to try to make talking about cybersecurity a regular part of the way that we do business. So we've started actually trying to talk about the contexts in which we work and some of the threats that we might face as part of a humanitarian response, as well as starting to try and share, where it's appropriate and where we can, data about attacks on NGOs between them to allow them to collectively defend. Thinking about money, we have a grant program, not just to fund NGOs to help kickstart projects which might close the gap a little bit, but also to try and start changing the financial culture around cybersecurity, to start getting NGO cybersecurity staff to think about non-traditional sources of funding for their programs, because there are many funders in this space who are interested in the problem area, and also building higher quality data to allow us to lobby for more, and in particular to lobby for more structured funding. So many people on the call will be familiar with the Center for Internet Security's Critical Controls. Version 8, which has just come out, has 18 key controls, which are broken down into subcontrols, which, based on their data and based on public knowledge about attacks against organizations, essentially represent a common denominator, which is compatible with frameworks like the PCI DSS framework, like NIST, like ISO 27001, but that is not only data-driven, but that is also quite practical, broken down into implementation groups and tiered for organizations who are looking for a sort of cybersecurity journey as they adopt the framework. Start with the basics, move on to the more advanced things. We adopted the CIS framework in NetHope a few years ago, and we're about to benchmark our member base for the second time to start to try and build really high quality data about the state of NGO cybersecurity programs at sectoral level, so that we can then, as an ecosystem, understand what to do about it, where to intervene, where the gaps are, what needs funding, what tech we need. and I maybe hinted at this earlier, but we know fundamentally that this is a collective problem. A breach in one NGO, generally speaking, will affect others. We know we can only win if we're able to work together in order to close the gap. So an ISAC is a pattern in industry, a space in which an industry will come together in order to collectively defend. We're trying to build one for the humanitarian sector. So I'm going to wrap up and hand over to the Avanade team in a second, but just a few takeaways to leave you with. Firstly, cybersecurity is not a technology problem. If your organization doesn't already have a conversation at organizational level, if you're not talking to your board about this, if you're not integrating it into your strategy, you should be. This is a problem. And secondly, in the work that you do on cybersecurity, don't just think about the tech. I've hinted at this already, that the CIS controls are a great place to start, but there are many of these sorts of frameworks. Think about the way you govern your cybersecurity program. Think about the way you report to your board. Think about the structure. If you don't get these things right, you're probably not going to end up with a cybersecurity program that works for you. The point I made before about automation, better than the rest doesn't work anymore. Your strategy needs to reflect this. And ideally, it should align with your program work. If you're not yet at the level where you can do a really thorough risk assessment and understand every space in which you might be exposed to a hostile criminal or state attacker, using something that has a maturity model or implementation groups like the CIS framework that moves from basic to more advanced is a nice way of doing this. But in a maturing or a mature cybersecurity program, you should be thinking about your business areas. Ideally, your cybersecurity senior leaders should be engaging with different business areas to understand how your program might need to flex to support them. And then lastly, the point I made about funding and about togetherness. For those of us who sub-grant, for those of us who are funders, thinking about the way we integrate cybersecurity into our funding, where we're doing digital interventions, how we ask for the right cost, where we're funding digital work, how we ensure that it's supported to be safe, but also how, as an ecosystem, we convene together in order to make those changes and collaborate. These are the only ways that we're going to solve the problem long term. And hopefully, if you're not already working with us on that problem, after this call, you'll come and work with us on it. With that, I'll hand back to the Avanade team. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for that insightful presentation. Many important takeaways that James shared with us. Cybersecurity requires the whole organization's effort, and cybersecurity needs to be rooted in what we do. And also what James mentioned, cybersecurity is something that we need to win collectively. So just want to say good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. My name is Andrea. I'm a cybersecurity consultant at Avanade. Greetings to you wherever you are from Frankfurt, Germany. So as we seek to unravel the complexities of cybersecurity within nonprofits, I would like now to turn our attention to a group of experts here today with us who will be sharing their insights. Bernice Russell-Bonn, CISO of RTI International, James Eaton-Lee, CISO of NetHope, and Rajiv Sagar, Avanade's Global Cybersecurity Lead. Welcome, Bernice, James, and Rajiv. Let's get started with maybe a short intro about yourself and your introduction and your organization. I mean, since our theme is how to hack a nonprofit, give us a quick response on how would you hack a nonprofit?
Okay, I'll jump in. Again, I'm Bernice Russell-Bonn, and I am the CISO at RTI International. And good morning, good afternoon, welcome to all. My role primarily is to ensure that we keep our institute safe, right? And I approach that from a risk management perspective. And so when you say how to hack a nonprofit, again, we look at it from a risk perspective, knowing what our assets are, knowing where our people are, knowing the activities and understanding what our people do, and try to make sure that we have controls and processes in place so that we are aware if something does not look normal. I'll put air quotes around that, and have the appropriate processes and procedures in place to address that.
James, do you want to go next? And
Happily, yes. So I've introduced myself already, but maybe one of the things I didn't say in my introduction was in a past life, this was my job as a cybersecurity consultant. I broke into things for a living. Anyone who does that will probably tell you start with the people. They're not always the weakest link in institutions, but quite frequently they are. And I touched on some of it in the kind of opening session, but not just the sort of user behavior that we're used to seeing. Anyone with an inbox will see their inbox full of invitations to click to make money or install the latest software update, which if you're an attacker, is a very easy way to get into somebody's workstation or get access to their account, which generally lets you access something else. But maybe for a sort of a second and a slightly different answer, and picking up on something Bernice said, the perennial challenge for any cybersecurity professional is asset management. It's just understanding what it is that you've got to defend. And when you're an NGO, you probably have a much larger attack surface. You have many more partners, many more technology systems than a private sector actor, and that huge diaspora of systems out there in your program work, maybe run by volunteers or by others. As an attacker, for me, that's fantastic, because if you're not thinking sustainably about how you fund, how you patch those systems, if you're not building things in a well-governed way, you probably have many systems you're not aware of that I'm interested in, many of which might be profitable for me to compromise or might have interesting data in them. So I'm going to go people, and I'm going to go big and broad and try to understand what's out there that isn't one of your core systems that you might have missed.
Excellent. That just leaves me. Hi, everyone. My name is Rajiv Segar. I'm responsible for Avanade's cybersecurity consulting business globally. And what do? We basically help our clients enhance their security posture on their journey to becoming cyber resilient. I don't believe we're ever going to get to 100% secure. And so we're going to get on that journey to become more resilient. And we believe that by doing this, we can help organizations protect the trust of everyone that they serve. And that may be their partners, their employees, or their vendors. I've been working in cybersecurity on and off for about 10 years, in the last 3 or 4 years with Avanade. And talking about where would I go for, my view on the Achilles heel of most organizations is normally the third-party vendors. I find that we may protect whatever we want, but there's always one little gap connecting us to some other party that they could be fixing air conditioning systems, they could be providing all sorts of services, and they're connecting to our systems. And we may protect our house, but this one little alleyway going to another vendor supply chain is where I would go in an attack, because I find that they seem to be one less step below. Sometimes that may depend on the vendor as well.
Thank you. So nonprofit organizations can become attractive targets for cyber criminals. James, you mentioned that as well earlier in your presentation. So the attackers may exploit the organization's reputations or the charitable causes to launch their cyber threats. We also saw on James' presentation earlier that in 2023, according to Microsoft, NGOs and think tanks are the second most targeted sector after government. We also know nonprofits often operate with limited financial resources, which can pose a challenge when it comes to investing in cybersecurity technologies and also people. So I'm interested to have your thoughts on this. Bernice and James, how can nonprofits strike a balance between allocating resources for their mission and investing in robust cybersecurity measures?
Yeah, I could. Oh,
Go ahead.
James. Okay. Again, I think it's important to understand what you have and have a and how critical it is. So, as you stated, we're all not-for-profits. We're not security companies, so we just don't have an unlimited stream of funds to support it. So it's very important to understand what is important to the organization and to be intentional about the controls you want to put in place, whether they're preventive or whether they are detective, so forth and so on. And I think it's the opportunity we have to try to have controls as inherent as possible. The way we protect data 3 years ago is different today. And so I think it's important to always look at your tool set and determine where can you collapse your your inventory. A lot of times we aren't taking advantages of all of the functionality tools give us. We constantly say, hey, there's a new toy for a SIMS, here's another one for endpoint. And now we have key vendors out here that give you the capability to really collapse and consolidate your footprint with vendors. We were just talking about vendor risk. And so one of the initiatives, I'll use that we are really saying what tools do we use for what purpose. Where do we have the opportunity to consolidate? Where do we have the opportunity to take advantage of functionality that we have in the past and reduce our footprint? That's one way that you can try to reduce costs, but yet not compromise on protecting your organization from being on the front paper. At the end of the day, that's one of the big things we want to protect against. So that's one of the ways we try to balance our funding with the fact of having resources for the mission of our organization.
Yeah, those are great thoughts. I would agree with all of that. Adding a bit, maybe, I think the matching the way you approach cybersecurity with your organization is one of the most critical things you can do. So what do I mean by that? Understanding what it is your organization has to protect, what kind of financial loss you might suffer, what kind of harm you might cause, and then establishing a baseline for your cybersecurity program that's linked to that. Now, that's intrinsically quite a difficult thing to do. If you look at a framework like ISO 27001, you'll probably find advice that says, do an organizational risk assessment, agree with your board what it is that, the risk tolerance is, and build your program based on that. It's great advice. If you're a small nonprofit or if you're just starting, it's intrinsically quite difficult to do, but there are shortcuts, right? So I mentioned this in the opener. Frameworks like the CIS framework, and actually most cybersecurity frameworks have this, usually have a sort of maturity model built in. And although there are some cybersecurity controls that might be less relevant to you, or you might choose to apply in a different way, chances are, if most organizations are applying passwords to accounts or rolling out multi-factor authentication, you probably want to as well. And by thinking about a structured programmatic approach to cybersecurity, and by going, these are the absolute basics we need to operate, it can be easier to start to have that conversation with boards or others about what the non-negotiables are, and go, well, look, these are just costs of doing business. We need to factor these into our budget. And of course, then you start to kind of integrate a little bit more closely with your business strategy. And this is where the role of the senior person in running your cybersecurity program, whether it's a CISO or something else, isn't just to plan, isn't just to build, isn't just to be the police. It's also to partner with your organization really deeply, and not just in order to tailor your cybersecurity to the organization, but also to think about more broadly how you use digital. I've found when I've done internal roles that actually there are weeks where as much of my time as a CISO or an information security professional is spent thinking about cybersecurity and what controls I want, or what detection and response technology I need, as are spent talking to business teams about what their broader digital needs are. Because when you can be smart, and I think this sort of dovetails with Benice's point about getting good use of the technology that you have, where you're smart in working with business teams to understand that they need to manage volunteers or store data out in the field, where you can be really proactive and partner with the rest of your organization. Not only do they make better use of digital, which as cybersecurity professionals is probably something that we all want to do anyway, but also you can start to make the cybersecurity cost less. In effect, you can start to think about cybersecurity problems long before they arise. So, rather than talking about the system that your team has implemented, which needs some controls retrofitted, you start to think way in advance about minimizing the amount of data that's collected to begin with, or how their strategic goal can be accomplished without collection or without build. So I think you start with that sort of you start just by replicating the practice of others. You think about maturity models, you think about good business practice, you pivot through tailoring to your business activities, and ideally you integrate really tightly, and you're this strategic ally that lets you reduce the size of the problem but also sell it better.
Thank you. What I see often is having poor password hygiene or falling victim to phishing attacks maybe due to a lack of cybersecurity awareness and understanding. In your opinion, what are the key steps nonprofits should take to create a strong cybersecurity culture within their organizations? Bernice, maybe we start with you.
Okay. Yeah, I think cyber security awareness is very key. Our company, our employees, our staff are our number one defense, honestly. And so it's very important of the awareness of protecting your information. What we find is that the more we can relate protecting company assets to your own personal assets, there's a easier understanding, and it helps to drive a good habit all the time. So we try to definitely we have awareness training for our staff, but we also send out notes probably twice a week, whether it's about an iPhone update or whether it's about something with a personal device, because again, we want staff to be safe at all times. And more, for flexibility, remote work, teleworking, people are accessing information from mobile devices, sometimes personal devices that you might have a mobile device management system on. But it's really about helping people to constantly be thinking about protecting their own data. Therefore, it's a little easier transition to understanding and protecting company data, to understand just the threats out there every day, whether it's phishing, watch out for these little phishing details, or just about keeping your device in the open, protecting your laptop, protecting your phone. So again, we try to approach it from a holistic perspective, just securing yourself and your data, including work. We do it that way. So yes. Mm-hmm.
I think making it relatable is really sound advice. One of the smarter things I've ever done as a cybersecurity leader actually was hire or get access to a comms person who, and I'm not going to pretend this was my idea, it was 100% theirs, but did a mapping of the different voices that work for different parts of our organizations, which I will freely admit did not match my intuition. It turned out that our finance team was extremely interested in a rights-based approach to cybersecurity, and actually some teams that I had intuited might like that kind of messaging really cared more about reputational finance. So thinking about what kind of messaging lands, and if you have the luxury of doing it, getting somebody whose job is communication or hiring for those skills in your team is a really smart thing to do. And you can be quite creative, I think. There's a whole answer to this question here, which is just around less confrontational approaches to cybersecurity. So building a team identity that is not one of being the department of no, but has this sort of partnership relationship. But in the way you build that relationship with your organization, you can be very creative. When I worked for an NGO, when the general data protection regulation in Europe was looming on the horizon, we did a pop-up event in our atrium, and to Bernice's point about making the professional personal, we actually set up a living room stand with some furniture in our atrium, and we hid data around it. So we had lists of people's names down the back of the sofa and CDs. And let me tell you what, when you set up a living room with pot plants in the middle of your atrium, I guarantee you get half the building coming down and sitting on your sofa, and then you trick them into a conversation about cybersecurity once they've played your scavenger hunt around the living room. So there are lots of different ways of doing this with, meme culture. I've used sort of internal social media tools. That consistent flow of communication, I think, which is not just about change your password or don't click on this thing, whatever it might be, but that connects it to the real world. Don't just communicate to your staff about what they shouldn't do. Communicate to them about what's changing or what's interesting, and really start to build that relationship deeply, I think, is the only way to make a meaningful dent in this.
Andrea, may I comment as well on just some of the areas that we've seen? So I was going to talk about some of the points that we've seen internally, and then how we've applied that to our clients as well. One was around, and I think you both hit upon it, Bernice and James, is bite size. I think with because you have different generations across the workforce over there, having this bite size type points make it really relatable, and also are easy to take in and be able to apply. And the second thing that we found really to make it a little bit more fun is we gamify a lot of those the learning process, right? So we say, well, not that we want to count anyone out, but, we send out phishing emails and then we see, how many people didn't make it through, right? Andrea's smiling because I don't know whether she got caught out with them. And then what we do is we get others to send out as well. So we get colleagues to be able to create their own phishing mails to other colleagues as well to see whether they get caught out. So just to gamify it kind of like makes it, part of the culture of the organization. I was just thinking about it like, security is everyone's business. Where my mom used to tell me when I was young, don't talk to strangers. She can't be there every time I'm out there everywhere. So she had to give me the tools and awareness so that in case a situation came up, I was able to work on it. And I think that's just that, old, no, it's not old, but I suppose it's just the way of thinking applies now as well across the board. Sorry, Andrea, apologies for the hijack there, but I wanted to make that point. Yeah.
Thank you, Rajiv. Thank you very much. So we also talk about third-party vendors. Rajiv, you mentioned this earlier. So nonprofits often rely heavily on third-party vendors, such as cloud services, donor management systems, or fundraising platforms. How do you ensure that these entities meet your organization's security requirements and that they do not pose any vulnerabilities or risks to your systems and data? James, would you like to start maybe?
Yeah, happily. And kind of connecting it back to the real world. And we've sort of indirectly touched on some of these examples already, but some of the most high profile breaches in nonprofits in the last few years have been have come from third-party vendors. So many people will be familiar with the breach in Blackboard. Many people will have seen the news cycle when SolarWinds, which is a network monitoring platform, was breached. We know that had a huge impact on an enormous number of nonprofits, but it's a very difficult problem. You're moving from the inside outside. You have a very different set of tools available to you as a cybersecurity professional when you're not looking at the blinking LEDs, when you can't walk over to the network infrastructure team, when you're working with a third party. You can Google, you can find a million really good third-party vendor due diligence forms, processes, checklists. That's generally the start in an organization. But you also need to be smart about it. Having also worked on the vendor side of the fence, lots of organizations are not smart in the way that they, saturate their vendor maybe with more questions than they need or don't dig into enough detail. So have a process for not just understanding what the vendor does, and there are lots of good shortcuts you can take. You can look for accreditation against an external cybersecurity standards, Cyber Essentials or ISO 27001, but also tailor it to what the vendor is doing for you. If somebody is holding your entire customer CRM system, you probably don't want to just ask them if they have ISO 27001. You probably want to dig into specific controls. You maybe want to engage more deeply to understand how to use the platform effectively. Whereas, if it's the sort of company that cleans your building, maybe your questions are different entirely. So I think the starting point probably is thinking about a process. Talk to your peers, talk to other people in the sector that you're in to understand what questions you might need to ask. Be smart and thoughtful about how diagnostic different types of questions, different types of due diligence are, questions about policy frameworks, accreditation, but also try and integrate it into your procurement process. Most procurement people that I've talked to are quite smart about thinking about commercial risk. They're very good at thinking about, the level of debt the suppliers have, or, the sort of longevity of the product or intellectual property. If you haven't already, this needs to be one of the risk thematics that you work with your procurement people in order to actually think about across your entire product catalog, because the temptation can be, as a cybersecurity person, to start very detailed and very deep, quite reactively based on the first supplier that's sort of comes across your desk. Probably doesn't scale. But if you work with your procurement team or your partnership team or whoever they are to really design something that's smart and that scales up and scales down based on the risk, I have yet to find a procurement person that doesn't want to do this exercise with me.
Yeah, all great points. Totally agree with James regarding, just that risk process, because not all vendors are the same, right? What are they doing? What services are they providing? Do they have access to data? What do they have access to? Again, so it's very important to understand the profile of that vendor, because I think you mentioned also too, James, because everything doesn't need to be protected the same. So you cannot just throw out this huge net of controls for everything. You have to understand what that profile is and then have the appropriate level of controls. But again, I think the number one thing is to understand that vendor profile, to do due diligence, to ensure that whatever controls they have in place, they are within the risk appetite for your company. And make sure that's a continuous process. It's not a one and done. There are third-party products out here who do vendor monitoring and due diligence for you and give vendors a score, just similar to our like a credit report for a vendor, right? And so there are some baselines that you can put out there to help determine. Another key thing I think also is which is coming up more and more, just about network segmentation, right? You have your Internet of Things. So, with all the automation, you have a lot of vendors that do things like your HVAC and, like you said, and maybe lighting and so forth. They don't need to be on the same network as your financial data and other key systems with critical data in it. So again, having that separation allows you to then customize your baseline of controls you have with particular vendors. And I think the last thing I think that's very important from a vendor perspective is to understand the redundancy. If that vendor is not available, what is the appropriate redundancy that you have in place? And then, and again, that's going to be based off criticality. You may be okay to not have anything with them, but especially for these cloud providers, you want to make sure that if something fails one place, they have a failover. So again, not to really jump into the weeds, but again, depending on that profile of what that vendor has access to, the data they may be storing and so forth, that will then kind of dictate the type of controls and or due diligence you do with those vendors to make sure that within the organization's risk appetite to use.
Your thoughts, Reggie?
No, I agree with what's being said over here. I mean, I think in terms of just, and Panish, you hit upon it. The fact is that you have people who are accessing your systems, and you want to be able to segment them out. But also, I think when we are doing any of the education as a whole, when we're educating, we need to include them as part of the awareness programs or the cultural change programs. And I think that's one. The second thing is, maybe I'm being a little bit more too tactical on this, but it's around identity management, right? As well as into what access do they have to the system? How is it that we can basically restrict it to really what they're doing, and making sure that we have a good governance process in place to remove them when they've been when they're not working with us anymore, right? Because you maybe the problem we have is that people at some of the vendors are maybe changing roles very often, and so there's Bob today, and then there's Jill tomorrow, and suddenly, they've got access to the system, which they shouldn't do. So being able to manage that in some way is quite key. Normally, just wanted to bring up some of the organizers we've worked with, they're actually, before they take on some of these vendors, they ask them to undergo an audit from a third party, which not everyone can afford to do, but they say as part of the procurement process, we want you to tell us what systems, what security systems, what is your security like at your organization? How do you maintain it? And that's another way that they go out, making sure that you can't do any work with us unless you've passed the test, right? So.
Interesting thoughts. Next thing that I want to have your insight is diversity. So a diverse workspace or workforce brings a wide range of ideas and bringing different perspectives, which can then lead to a more effective cybersecurity strategies and practices. What are your thoughts on this? How important is it to recognize that diversity is a strength that can lead to innovation and enhance the overall effectiveness of cybersecurity efforts? And also, how do you see this helping the talent gap? Bernice, would you like to start?
Absolutely. I think diversity is critical. You have to have different perspectives to try the solution. You don't want everybody coming from the same background, the same thought process. because that's not who you're dealing with when you're looking at your threat, right? Your threat actors and so forth. And so I think it's very important to have a diverse work group from an age perspective, from a to have females in cybersecurity, and it's that, again, to have a diverse workforce as much as possible, because as we try to problem solve, I'll tell you my perspective, and I'm, then, and I smile when I say that I'm a little older than some of the other folks on my team, but they deal with technology different from me. It's the second nature to them. And so one of the critical things I would say when implementing security is to cause as less friction as possible with your end users, because the more friction you cause, they won't use it, right? So it's very important to understand how someone 25 wants to get access and do their work, and the flexibility is different from my user who may be 55, and security awareness is different for the different people and the different roles they have within the organization. And so again, I think it's very important to have the input of a diverse group to solve tough problems, and in the long run, it's more cost effective to solution from a diverse group to try to get these answers to tough questions and tough situations that we're trying to avoid for our companies, i.e., again, that reputational risk and things of that nature. Okay.
I'll pick up there, maybe. Agree with all of these thoughts. I mean, firstly, let's be honest, it's just the right thing to do, but it's absolutely also the most effective thing to do as a business. The sort of image we often have of cybersecurity is, green text on a black background. Those roles exist, that space exists. It's far and away not representative of the entire cybersecurity space. In a mature organization, you need all sorts of skills. You need people who can communicate, who can analyze, who can understand, who can persuade, people who have deeply technical skills, people who have very sort of psychosocial skills. They don't exist in every particular group of people. If your hiring process, if your team development, if your team structure before you've even got to hiring a particular role doesn't leverage and think about all of those skills, you're cutting off huge proportions of the workforce from being able to accomplish kind of useful things for you. And particularly when you're in an NGO, if you're thinking not just about liability or regulatory fines, if you're thinking about impact on people, and if your cybersecurity program also touches on data protection, if it thinks about how you use data, you also cut yourself off from the lived experience of what your work actually looks like. If you're in an international NGO and you're hiring purely domestically and you're hiring a particular demographic of people, and you're not providing opportunities for people who are, across a range of sort of low and middle income countries or different locales, and your job includes understanding the impact on those communities, how can you understand what that impact is if you don't have people who have lived experience of what happens when things go wrong in your team? It just doesn't work. And then kind of, broadening out on this sort of enlightened systemic self-interest point, one of the things I mentioned, I think, in the introduction was that we do cybersecurity training. We ran 73 people through the SANS, the GFAC course, SEC 275's foundational cybersecurity training. We had candidates in Malawi, Senegal, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, 20 countries across Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. We know that long-term, as international NGOs, the only way we solve the cybersecurity problem is not just if we broaden where we pull in skills from, but also if we broaden the size of that pool itself. We know that there are not enough people internationally to meet the cybersecurity need today, and particularly as nonprofits. If we don't play an active part, not only in drawing upon the existing ecosystem of talented people in all of the countries and spaces we operate in, but also stimulating that pool so it's bigger next year and bigger than in the next decade, we're actually making the problem bigger for ourselves. So, even if at the kind of where the metal meets the meat operationally now, you've maybe got all of the skills you need. Thinking kind of long term, if we're not, sort of diverse and inclusive in the way we build our teams, hire people, stimulate skills, we're just making the problem harder for ourselves long term.
Yeah, I was just thinking about James of Jules. Sorry, Andrea.
No, Rajiv, go ahead. I was just about to.
Yeah, I was going to say that, diversity in the workforce means diversity in thought, and that's what both James and Bernice are bringing up. And James, what I really liked about what you said around the training with the Science Institute is great, because what we're talking about is the fact that we want to find people. We want to address the talent gap by finding people that have key traits: curiosity, problem solving, critical thinking. Right? These are essentials for the field of success. The technical training can be taught, right? But these traits are really hard to find. So by widening that, the whole, the people that we can actually go after and train helps by going, by broadening it up and looking at underrepresented communities in our whatever locale or our area that we're working in. And I think, I worked in Africa and I've worked in Asia, and I totally get what you mean. The thought processes are different, right, from the US and Europe. Even within Europe, there's difference as well. So having that access and having people from these different areas really ensures that when we are protecting ourselves, we're doing it in a way that we're able to bring in the diversity of thought from what could be impactful in that particular community or area or country. And so, no, it's great. We by ourselves, we created cyber academies because we couldn't find enough people ourselves in order to be able to fulfill some of the roles. In the cyber academies, we are hiring a lot of people from the diverse range of groups across the world, and we train them in the technical skills, and we bring in, just make sure that have they got the traits, the problem solving, the curiosity, and the critical thinking, and then we train them on the technical skills, which may be a little bit more around Microsoft. But then they are deployed with us, and then sometimes they go and work with our clients, or they can go and work, they go and do volunteer work with some of the NGOs as well. Andrea, I think you've seen that happening in Europe as well, right? When we were doing that. So
Yes, it's a successful program at Avanade. You touched about the next topic earlier in your presentation, James, about the role, the importance of the board and the leadership. So I would like to hear your insight, three of you. What role does the board and leadership play in establishing a strong cybersecurity framework within the nonprofit organization? James, would you like to start maybe?
Sure. If it wasn't clear already, I talk in strange metaphors, and the metaphor I often use for this is that it's a bit like the space you have to navigate in. If you're sailing, it's the amount of ocean that is accessible to you and where the winds blow. If your board is not brought in, you have a very small amount of space to move around in, and the wind maybe is not blowing in the direction that you need. Whether that means that you don't have support to write budgets or roll out organizational change programs, integrate into the right parts of the organization who maybe you've not got such a strong relationship with. If you've not got a board that is supporting what you do as a cybersecurity leader, your work is much harder. I've heard the work of a cybersecurity team described a couple of times as being a bit like running a business within a business. You have to be quite entrepreneurial, particularly if you're in that kind of growth stage. You have to have a great product. You have to sell the product to an audience of people who don't necessarily want it. The value proposition has got to be really clear, and if you don't have a board supporting you in order to do that, it's really tricky. But I also made the point about tailoring what you do to an organization. The boards of organizations, or in a non-profit, its trustees are the guardians of purpose for the organization, and that usually the place where all the knotty, difficult decisions about strategy or risk end up gravitating to, whether it's sort of responsibility or being informed. And once you've moved beyond rolling out MFA and patching all of your systems, we only run effective cybersecurity programs as nonprofits if we really start to integrate deeply, particularly into more risky and more challenging areas of our work: advocacy, campaigning, humanitarian response, conflict, things that involve large amounts of data, and understanding the link, making good decisions about what's safe for organizations, maybe where to engage and where not to engage. This is the province of the trustees or the board, and you need to enlist them, to help you make those decisions well, or maybe to help them make those decisions well. So they provide space, they give you the freedom to operate, they put wind in your sails, but also they're a key strategic partner once you move out of the technical and actually start thinking about what cybersecurity means for your organization. So if they're not there, you can build a program, you can run it, it might be partially successful, but it's never going to really sing.
Yeah, totally agree. I'll just add a little bit that I think it's it's very important for the board to understand and look at cyber as a business decision. Cyber is not a standalone. Cyber is a part of the business, and it has to be a part of your roadmap for where you think the company is going. And so it's a little bit of a different view. And I say that because I think I mentioned earlier, security needs to be as inherent as possible. So when we start talking about the strategy of the non-for-profit, security is the enabler to help to do a lot of these different, or to reach a lot of these strategic goals. So it needs to be a part of the conversation when solutioning. Is how do we provide it safely? And so that's a big part, and that's going to be all gauged on the risk appetite of the executive leadership team and the board. And so it's just communicating what the different risks are of supporting certain type of business in certain parts of the world, certain research, things of that nature. But looking at security as an enabler to solve problems, to expand services and things of that nature, and having it be a part of the solution, not an afterthought. So that's the big piece of it. And the other part I will add too, which, I've had a couple of conversations with our board. There's expectations that are starting to rise for public companies about the board and understanding cybersecurity and reporting responsibilities if there's a cyber incident within your company. We'll probably see this rolling over to the nonprofit within another year or so. Whatever happens in the public eventually comes on down to our space. So there is an expectations of more transparency that will enable us all to protect our companies a little bit better by learning from challenges or events that happen in other companies, and that transparency to the people that we service too. So again, there is definitely an expectation that our board understands what's going on from a risk and how we're best trying to solve those problems to enable us to meet the strategic goals of the company.
Rajiv, would you like to add something?
Yeah, no, look, both Bernice and James hit the nail on the head. I think boards seem to be more aware of the cyber risks than before. But what we found is that the questions they ask imply that they don't fully comprehend the impact of cyber risk on the overall enterprise risk. So they struggle to determine which questions to ask the security team to assess what is the risk and be able to make the right decisions going forward. So what it does mean is that it comes down, unfortunately, the onus lies on the security leadership to basically outline how can they, outline the financial, the economic, and the operational impact of the cyber risk, not just the technical aspect of it. So going beyond just not the technical, but impacting that. And then linking that risk to how it will, as part of the cyber risk management, linking that to showing how will it achieve the business objectives or the NGO's objectives or the MPO's objectives, right? How can it, by doing that? Because, some people don't even understand that the cyber risk is reputational risk, right? For donors, for people who are interacting with that organization. So be able to put it in a format which basically outlines that will make them help the board become a supporter rather than a hinderer to what we want to implement on the security end side.
Thank you. Rajiv, I actually have a couple of questions for you. First question is, what are some emerging cybersecurity trends or technologies that nonprofits should pay attention to, and considering incorporating them into their security strategies? And question two is, what are some cost-effective yet impactful cybersecurity solutions nonprofits can adopt?
Yeah. Look, there's a number of trends, and if you go on, you'll find a whole bunch of them. There's a few which I think are really important. One is around, trend one, I would say, is around human-centric security design. And that is, and I think, Bernice, you talked about it, right? The traditional security awareness programs they're not basically doing what they need to do. They're not reducing unsecure employee behavior, right? So what we need to design is a way to be able to make sure that the teams on the ground, our employees on the ground, have a way of not just education, but how can we make sure that we design systems and processes to be able to reduce the impact that they will have on security risk, right? And this goes even for remote working as well. We talk also about zero trust architecture, but I'm not going to go into that over here. The other one is around, trend two is around cybersecurity platform consolidation. And that is, there are, I've heard up to 83, sometimes 100 products being used by organizations. And there is a focused process to be able to reduce them down. And by reducing them down, you reduce your cost of training, integration, and product licensing, right? So cost. So overall, it can help. So this going from, moving from best of breed to platform is a much better approach. We discussed about the boards, right? That's really important. That's a trend, which is making sure that, we have got the boards on board is very important. And then trend four, I would say, is around this continuous threat exposure management. And this can be done in a number of ways, but making sure that we are doing penetration testing, looking at managed detection response, having, a partner, a supplier vendor partner working with us on detection response, continuously managing that is an important way of making sure we're moving forward. And then I'd say trend number 5 is not trend, it's more of a technology. And everyone talks about Gen AI, generative AI and stuff. The AI is being used by the bad guys and the bad threat actors, all the threat actors as a whole, and we need to be able to manage that. But from a organization standpoint, generative AI, the way it's set up, can allow our security teams to basically take on work and understand and manage security in a way that they've not done before, because they don't need to know as much as they thought they did, because the generative AI basically, as Microsoft calls it, a security co-pilot. It helps them sitting next to them, being able to help them manage the security risk within the organization. And then in terms of cost-effective, impactful security solutions for nonprofits, number one on that list is employee training and awareness. That nothing's gonna go unless you got that sort of, that's number one, right? And I know I'm talking basics when we talk about, keeping systems and software updated, but it's amazing how often that's just not been done. Implementing multi-factor authentication. We talked about third-party products, third-party vendors, third-party products was in my head. Third-party vendors, making sure that when they have access, anybody access, we have got this extra layer of security. And it's not that much significant financial investment, but it does mitigate the risk. Making sure that you have an incident response, backup, and disaster recovery plan. I think that's just very basic, table 6, as I heard it's been called. It just needs to be there. And then the last one, I would say it's not a solution, but a suggestion, is in terms of partnering with organizations with expertise. There are a lot of companies out there that will work with NGOs and NPOs, just helping them to manage the threat landscape. We talked about NetHope, the way that they've been working as well. By engaging these third-party professionals for periodic security audits, penetration testing, and identify vulnerabilities will really help to mitigate risks effectively. That's my long and short of it all, Andrea.
Thank you, Rajiv. So we have covered a lot of ground today and learned a great deal about the challenges nonprofits face, but also impactful solutions that can be adopted. We encourage you to continue the discussion, raise any questions you may have, and reach out to us anytime. Thank you, Bernice, James, and Rajiv for your time and for sharing your insight. I'm handing the session now back to you, Maddie. Thank you.